There is over in by the United Nations, over on, I guess, First Avenue, Turtle Bay. There's a wall where this word from Isaiah is inscribed. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. It's the Isaiah wall. Maybe you've walked by it or seen it. And I think the whole UN complex there is a monument to that vision when swords are turned into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. And indeed, the many attempts, I think, have been made to realize that vision, especially in the last 100 or so years after World War I, the League of Nations, the Second World War, the United Nations, the peace movement of the 1960s, and even now. And yet, we still have wars. Nations are still beating their plowshares into swords and pruning hooks into spears, not the other way around. And so I think it's very reasonable to ask, when will it be that Isaiah's utopic vision will come to pass? When will it be? The text today, both the Old Testament reading from Isaiah and the gospel lesson from Matthew, are talking about that vision, that messianic, that Isaiac vision of God's kingdom. And when will it come? Isaiah describes the coming kingdom, and he tells us what it will be like. He says that the Temple Mountain in Jerusalem will be raised up, and nations will migrate towards it. Nations will be drawn towards it. A divine calling brings them there, calls them to this temple. And from Jerusalem, the word of the Lord and God's law goes out, and the nations are taught. And as we just sung in the hymn, justice is restored, judgments are just again, and the world is at peace, and neither shall we learn war anymore. I think there's certainly a mystical element to this whole Isaianic vision. It is, after all, a vision. This one city becoming the home of all people, the national God of Israel becoming the God of all nations. It's a kind of universalism that contemplatives like Richard Rohr describe. They describe this ability to see the many in the one and the one in the many as the heart of a coming universal spirituality. But when remains the question. And so Isaiah concludes on a practical note. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord. In other words, let us walk now by the light we already have. Let us live now as if this prophecy about Jerusalem's exaltation has already been fulfilled. And if to underscore that practical religion, that practical duty, that practical note, it's made explicit, I think, in today's lesson from Matthew. Because what do we hear? What do we see? We have Jesus describing a very humdrum, day-to-day existence, the patterns of life, of eating and drinking, of marrying and giving in marriage. Life continues on now, much as it did before the flood, and yet they didn't know until the flood came and swept them all away. Who knows what sort of visions they dreamed then in those days, and yet they were swept away. These texts are paired as if to say that there is certainly a place for mysticism. There's certainly a place for the visionary and the vision, for the prophetic vision especially. But they also say we can't live with our heads in the clouds. Jesus offers very ordinary precautions for us all to take, what we all do every night: bar the door, lock it, turn on the light, set the security alarm. These practical, common sense ways of living our lives. He uses them. Jesus uses this practical common sense as a way to correct the mystical, the utopic, and this end of world thinking, which people have a tendency to get carried away with. Jesus says, therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. In other words, live as if the mystical vision could come true at any moment. Live as if this mystical vision, this mountaintop moment, could become a practical reality that you'd have to deal with, much like a thief breaking into your house. Live as if your faith in Jesus Christ will turn to seeing him face to face, perhaps when you least expect it. I think the mystical vision of utopia, which means, of course, nowhere, is attractive to us for many reasons. It's attractive to us because so much about the real world is not attractive. Paul also, I think, picks this up with this very practical note in his lesson today. Basically, what Paul is saying is, wake up, dreamers. You know what hour it is, how it is full time now for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. We don't know what day Jesus is coming, Paul is saying, but we do know it's one day closer than yesterday. And so Paul's advice is not to retreat into further contemplation or even further prayer or religious piety. Paul's advice is to cast off the works of darkness and to conduct ourselves becomingly as in the day, not reveling in drunkenness or debauchery or licentiousness or quarreling and jealousy. Now, maybe you're thinking that the mystical vision and the utopic vision are so much nicer and you'd rather live there. And maybe it's also comforting because it doesn't really challenge us to change. We can, after all, build a monument or a sculpture or an entire complex and call it a monument to peace. We can say it expresses our highest aspirations and desires. We can pass all sorts of resolutions and pass all sorts of laws, all of which may be high and noble sounding and sound good and seem good. But does that visionary exercise, does that kind of political mysticism, does it allow us to avoid the practical work of beating our swords of jealousy into plowshares of patience? Are we avoiding taking the spears of our lust and turning them into the pruning hooks of faithfulness and self-control? Because I think far from being spiritual, I think sometimes a mystic vision is more likely to become something very carnal. And so what do I mean by carnal? Well, carnal is the word for flesh. And Paul writes, make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. I think it's very easy to become satisfied with our vision of the world as it should be. I think it's very easy for ourselves to gratify ourselves, thinking we're working towards making that vision a reality, but all the while ignoring the fact that we live in the days of Noah, or that we live as in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So I think left on its own, this mystical vision, this mysticism that is so prevalent, I think, in these readings for Advent, and really even prevalent in the holiday decorations that we put up. We've just transformed Franklin Avenue in Millbrook to a wonderland. We're having the parade of lights. All of these things are good, but we call it a wonderland. It's a fairy world we're making when building. It's not reality. We spend a whole month doing this. And so remember, Advent comes to tell us, Advent begins this season on Advent Sunday with a heavy dose of practical common sense to arrest that escapism. Because otherwise, if we don't, the mystical vision can leave us very unprepared. It can leave us unprepared and not able to see how truly unprepared we are. Now, I'm not saying there's no place for mysticism and vision, because we've just read a prophet's vision. The Bible itself ends with another vision, the book of Revelation. So there is a place for vision and mysticism, especially when we understand that Jesus comes to make the divine vision a reality and that he comes to prepare us to live in it. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Jesus is very consciously taking this Isaianic phrase, this passage of this vision of a mountain in Jerusalem being lifted up and drawing all nations to it. He's very consciously appropriating that for himself, for his own body, for the reality, the hard reality that is the cross, that bloody, harsh reality. Because I think that's what we need to have at the back of all of our visions and all of our mystical experiences, is that reality. The hard stone, the hard wood, the iron nails. Nothing about the cross makes provision for the flesh. And there isn't even anything gratifying about it, which is why many would like to think of other things than the cross. But in fact, it's that instrument by which God makes us ready to enter his vision his vision come to life, his kingdom on earth. Because there on that cross, he strips us of our sin and he clothes us in our righteousness. He takes that which cannot enter into the kingdom and purifies us of it so that we can live there, so that the vision won't just be our dream, but his dream come true. So, Advent, the first Sunday, the holidays, maybe you've already bought your tree, maybe you've already set up everything, and that's okay. But remember that we have something real to look forward to, and we have something practical to do now. We have the joy of meeting Jesus face to face to look forward to. And then when we see him, it will not be in a mystical sight or in a vision, but it will be the face of a familiar friend. And exactly how we see him will be different for each one of us, because even his own disciples saw him in different ways. And that's the place, I think, where your own vision and your own mystical sight comes into play. There is a place for it, but be prepared for it to become real. And be prepared for Jesus to be yours for all eternity. The promise of Advent is that this joyful reunion with Jesus is not that far off, and that, in fact, it is getting closer every year now, which is all the more reason to get to know him now. Amen.